Just oh, okay. Okay, we're
All
live.
right, so hello everyone, we're live. I'm here with Lance Bush, the final boss of moral anti-realism on the internet. Lance, he has a blog which is linked below. He also has a YouTube channel which I think I forgot to link, but you should be able to find it from the blog. Lance and I, we've talked before. We've talked about moral realism. I think now we're going to be talking mostly about in this chat about theism. But yeah, so Lance, thanks for being on the channel. For those who don't know who you are, who are you?
So I'm Lance. You already mentioned that. So I do philosophy. I do psychology. A big focus for me is specifically the psychology of metaethics. So I study how non-philosophers think about metaethical questions, primarily about moral realism and anti-realism. But I also do broader work in moral psychology and experimental philosophy, which basically uses the tools of the social sciences to explore traditionally philosophical questions, often by studying how non-philosophers think about philosophical issues. So I do all that work. Yeah, that's what I do. And yeah, I got the blog and the YouTube channel and all that stuff. And that's one thing I do, because I could be spending 100% of my time trying to publish papers, like academic papers, but I'm going to keep freezing up like that. I really think it's an important feature of doing the kind of work that I do to sort of make it accessible to the public and talk to people. And I also think it's a good way to grow and learn about things. I feel like a lot of what ends up happening with academics is if you cloister yourself away and things get too insular, you don't get enough engagement with the outside world. And I think that could cause sort of intellectual atrophy in your way of thinking about things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all that. So okay, so I think we were going to talk about theism. So I guess I can walk through very briefly why I'm a theist. So, it's not just one argument, it's a sort of cumulative case, which generally is the reason why people adopt broad worldviews. But there are a few things that I find very convincing. One of them is I'm quite moved by the psychophysical harmony argument. I know you don't like that one, and that'll get into broader disputes about philosophy of mind. I think if you have my views on philosophy of mind, psychophysical harmony will be very convincing. If you have your views, it won't be convincing at all. And then I think it'll come down largely to our very, very different intuitions about philosophy of mind. I'm very persuaded by the fine-tuning argument, by the fact that the laws of physics are such that if you tweak them slightly, no life could arise. And even more basically than this point about how the fundamental laws of physics work, there's this broader conceptual point that just, if you think about the initial ways a system could be, like think about, just imagine writing a computer program to make dots move around. By far the simplest ones you could have would produce nothing interesting. And so it's very improbable that we would get something interesting. And so that favors theism. And then, so I'm very moved by both this sort of conceptual point behind fine-tuning, that you just need a very improbable initial state, set of laws, and set of constants to get an interesting physical system at all. And then also by the fact that our laws of physics fall in this narrow range needed for life. And then the third argument that really convinces me, I mean, there are more, but these are sort of the big three, is called the anthropic argument. And so the idea behind the anthropic argument is there's a view. So anthropics is the study of your existence. And so there's a view of anthropics called the self-indication assumption. And what the self-indication assumption says is that given that you exist, you get evidence that there are more total people that exist. So for example, suppose a coin gets flipped. And if it comes up heads, one person gets created. And if it comes up tails, a billion people get created. Suppose I get created by this process. The self-indication assumption says that my credence in the coin coming up tails should be a billion times my credence in the coin coming up heads, because it's a billion times likelier that I would exist. So, and we can talk about the self-indication assumption and why I think it's true. I think it's, of all the philosophical views I hold, this is maybe the one I hold most strongly, where I think it's just supported by these like completely ironclad arguments. So I think the self-indication assumption is right. And then once you grant the self-indication assumption, I think it allows a very strong argument for theism, because if more people existing is more likely, well, plausibly it's a good thing to create a happy person. And so then God would be likely to create sort of all possible people, because, he has no reason to stop at like 5,000. And so then he would just keep going until he makes all possible people. And so that means that the number of people on theism on average is much higher than on atheism. And so your existence majorly favors theism. So I guess those are kind of the big three arguments that I like most. And then there are more that I also find somewhat convincing, but yeah, those are the big three. And what really changed my mind was just I sort of I thought more about the arguments as I thought about them more. I was moved by the evidence.
So a few questions about this. I'm actually curious about the timeline because I remember not long ago that you had said that you were agnostic. And if I recall, you may have said something like you're like 50-50 at a certain point. But if I project backwards through history, like I don't have like a credence journal from you. So I don't know that 2 years ago you were at like 94% and then it was gradually dropping. I don't know. Oh, what does that timeline look like in terms of where you were at, say, a few years ago, however far back you want to go, up until present, where there was a sort of flip? Like, when did the flip occur, if it occurred at a specific point, and like what was happening through that process?
Yeah, so there was a flip, and I think that the initial jump was due to non-rational reasons. So up until maybe 6 months ago, I don't know the exact date, I was very sold on atheism. I was very convinced that there was no God. I'd have put the odds of that at many thousands of times the odds that there was a God. And I was reading Andrew Hronich's book where he argues for the existence of God. And as I was reading it, it just sort of struck me that this seems like a way that fundamental reality might be. When you just think about this picture on which everyone's saved, on which reality ends up being infinitely good for everyone, that starts to seem like the type of thing a perfect being might do. And so just for some reason contemplating that made it so that theism stopped seeming just categorically off the table as an option. It started seeming like, okay, maybe it's right, maybe it's not, but it's at least worthy of consideration. And so that got me to maybe 8% or something, or I don't know exactly. And then after that, it was just sort of over time, I considered the evidence more. My credence went up. So, it went to 30% and then jumped to 50%. Now I'd say it's a bit over 50% at like maybe 65% or something. So it just sort of, it went up over time. I'd say it cracked. It went a bit above 50% like 3 weeks, a month ago. I don't know exactly.
Oh, wow. So very recent.
Yeah. I mean, when I became a theist, or a few days after it, I wrote an article where I explained that, so I can actually find the exact date. Yeah, so it was on May 11th, was like a few days after I became sold on theism.
Let me see when that was. That's only a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I'm a newly minted theist. But yeah,
so that's interesting.
It was like more, then atheist, then credence goes up, agnostic, up to theism. So if we extrapolate out the trend, I'll be at 100% soon.
Here's the thing about that. I had seen you posting like basically steel manning or playing devil's advocate for arguments for theism like months and months ago. It's not 2 weeks ago. It was much further than that. And I've been interested in your perspective on things because you have this big post on moral realism that I have yet to respond to. It's like 2 years old now, almost. So I got to get around. I started drafting something and just got out of hand. So I'll have to get to that at some point. But I like that there's someone publicly engaging on topics that I care about, and I just wish like more people that study this stuff did that. So you do. So you're on the radar for someone whose stuff that I follow. And I saw this and I shared it around a bit. I'm like, look, like Matthew's arguing for the existence of God. This is like someone that's like big time atheist. And several of those people were like, they expressed that they had a suspicion that either you already had become a theist or that something had happened that you began leaning in that direction. And this goes back months. So one question I have is, have you seen, has anyone told you that they had this impression that you were moving towards theism prior?
No, though I think I wrote a 3-part series called just like Steel Manning Theism or something. And I think at that time, that was before I had even started to seriously consider it. Like that was just, I think it's important to steel man views that you don't adopt. And maybe that was part of the process of raising my credence in theism. Like, thinking through that, it became clear, okay, there's some evidence for theism. But yeah, I don't think that it wasn't like I was really sympathetic to theism, and then that's what caused me to start writing those posts. It was that maybe the causal story went the other way around, or maybe there just isn't a causal story. Yeah, it's sort of hard to know. Though, I mean, I don't know, like sort of having the arguments for theism be compiled into this one, in this one place, that definitely, like, just thinking about what the best you can say in favor of a view is makes it so that in the future, when you're thinking through the view, you have a nice compilation of the arguments that move you, so you can think through them in a sort of orderly and systematic way.
Yeah, I do wonder often, because like people have asked me, like, how did you get into philosophy, or why did you end up holding this view or that view? And I remember one of my friends had asked me about how I got into philosophy, and then I said something like, I thought about it for a second. I was like, I could tell you some story, but it's probably going to be bullshit. Like, and keep in mind, though, like what you're talking about happened like 2 weeks ago. So I'm not making a comparison in that respect. Like, I totally grant you have access to your thoughts 2 weeks ago, especially because you blog and you write them down. I didn't write any of this stuff down, and they were asking me something that happened like 20 years ago. And when something happened 20 years ago, it's all foggy. Like I used to be a Christian. I barely remember what that was like. So I realized whatever story I told would be so partially confabulated that I wasn't even comfortable telling a story. But to set that issue aside, that just like memory gets foggy with the decades, there's also just that, like, whatever narrative I weave, I expect that I'm going to want it to be self-flattering, that it's going to paint things in a coherent way. If there's gaps, I'm going to try to fill the gaps in with reasonable speculation. It's almost like it's not like I have direct access to my past, like in video file, and like you roll the video and you don't just see the images, you actually hear the thoughts that you once had. I don't have that. So in a certain sense, I'm actually theorizing about what I think I thought. And I wonder if there is stuff going on unconsciously behind the hood, if you had started like months before thinking at the time, I'm like an atheist and I'm very confident about that, but I'm going to Steelman. There is a question. What prompted you to do that rather than something else? Because you're not seeing me Steelman Christianity, or not Christianity, like theism on my blog. And maybe I have an objectionable emotional barrier to do so. So I'm not even saying it's like unvirtuous to do this, but is there a possibility, in other words, what I'm trying to get at, is there a possibility that sort of unconscious dams were cracking and breaking down outside of your awareness, and you just don't have introspective access to that?
I mean, yeah, certainly possible. I mean, I don't think that, yeah, I mean, that could be, I mean, one thing is that I've done this other times for views that I'm not at all sympathetic to. In fact, I think I had one where I steelmanned your sort of flavor of anti-realism. And you said good things about the Steelman, I thought, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. Yeah, I do wonder though how much it's possible to steelman a description of a view rather than the reasons for why one holds the view, in a way that is less transformative in its effect on one. Like, so like I could make a description. I could do a really accurate description if I went and studied it for like a religion I totally don't believe, or like the powers of telepathy or something like that. But that would be very different than digging into the arguments. And so there might be an asymmetry in what you did in my case, because it's not, you expressed my view, but not so much like my reasons for holding the view, I think. Whereas arguments for theism,
I gave some reasons, if I remember correctly, and I did a similar thing at one point with moral particularism. I think I just sometimes do this with views that I've been thinking a lot about, even if I'm not very sympathetic to them. Like, I've done that with Christianity more recently, even though I'm not that sympathetic to Christianity. And I did it with moral particularism. I think, sometimes I'll have something I've been thinking about, and I'll write a post sort of making the case for it.
Well, I guess I'm shooting myself in the foot a little bit, but it's just like one thing I would say though is my reasons for being an anti-realist, I would say, do seem, at least on a surface level, more sparse than the arguments people have presented for and against theism. One is a whole literature, one is a particular person's perspective that you're seeing from the outside. Those are very different things. So I do think there's some potentially substantive differences, but I grant that you can take time to devil's advocate or steelman views you don't hold in other cases. And that's some evidence that, like, it's not like every time you start steel manning something 6 months later, you endorse the view because there's other examples where you clearly didn't do this. So fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I think that's why the theism post was longer. And it was a 3-part series, if I remember correctly. But
Have you done that sort of thing? Like, I guess I wouldn't expect much to come of this because I think we would probably agree, but this is just because I have a generally pessimistic attitude. I don't actually think arguments for anti-realism in the literature are that good. So I don't even feel like I'm not confident if you went and had to stillman the hell out of like argument from disagreement or like Mackey's arguments that you would come away with that going, I guess there's a case for anti-realism because I don't really like any of those arguments myself.
yeah, I mean, I think that there is basically one argument for moral realism and like a few arguments for anti-realism, and most of them suck. But the main reason to be an anti-realist is if you just don't buy the argument for moral realism. Like, the argument for moral realism is look how obvious moral realism is when you think about it intuitively. And, if something seems really obvious to you, you should believe it. And then the arguments for anti-realism are like, they're just trying to undercut that core argument by either giving evolutionary debunking arguments or arguing that even if it's intuitive on its face, there's something strange about it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, the reason the theism post was longer was just there are a lot more arguments both for and against theism. There's the problem of evil, there's the fine-tuning argument, there's divine hiddenness, there's inconsistent revelation. Theism, and this is one thing that I think makes it a fun and exciting topic, where you're not just retreading the same ground over and over again, but you can levy arguments from like all different areas of philosophy. Like what are the other subjects where relevant to it is like these deep metaphysical questions about grounding? I think Sijuwade has some argument for God from that. I do not understand the argument. I at one point listened to him give a talk on it, and I have no idea what was going on. But Sijuwade's argument, from grounding and then philosophy of mind with psychophysical harmony and anthropics, it's like, all the different areas of philosophy. And then, the philosophy of time with A theory and B theory and the Kalam, I think it's an interesting area because, all these different topics from all these different areas become super relevant.
Yeah, it does seem like a richer field of inquiry. It was something that I spoke about with Danny. I don't know if you know Danny from Phil Talk about how because he does philosophy of religion, and it does look like if you get into philosophy of religion, you kind of got to get into every area of philosophy to a significant extent. I do think there's some degree of that going on in metaethics. It's hard to do metaethics without some engagement with epistemology and metaphysics, philosophy of language. But philosophy of religion just brings everything in, like everything, all the special sciences, like philosophy of physics, philosophy of time, philosophy of biology even could come into, I don't know, like everything comes into it. So there's something at least intriguing about it in that respect, that if you study philosophy of religion, you kind of got to dig into everything.
And not just and not just everything in philosophy, but like lots of different scientific fields and history of surrounding the resurrection and maybe historical method. I think it's interesting because there's just always more to learn. There's stuff from biology about the probability of abiogenesis. There are all these interesting things. So I think it's a very cool subject because it requires thinking about a lot of different subjects in clear ways. But sorry, go ahead. You were starting to say something.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask about is that you mentioned these sort of the three arguments that sort of dialed up the belief in theism, but there's also something to be said for recognizing good responses to arguments against theism. And I'm wondering what role that played in your belief. So for instance, I saw that you had a blog post where you were giving a kind of your own approach to how to address the problem of evil. And I believe I've heard you say that the problem of evil is the strongest or one of the strongest arguments against theism, or at least certain forms of theism. And so it like giving good responses to arguments against could also play an important role in sort of dialing up the belief. So I'm wondering what role that all played.
Yeah, so I don't think that played a huge. I mean, I like thinking about it over time. I got better and better theodicies, which weakened the problem of evil. So the problem of evil stopped seeming like this obviously, impossible argument to get around, and it started to seem like it's a really difficult challenge. And I think it's, I think it's a very convincing argument. But I think there are enough arguments on the other side that there are enough to overcome the problem of evil. I don't think it was so much just like what coming up with this, devastating theodicy that destroys the problem of evil. But instead, it was coming up with enough plausible things to say about the problem of evil that I felt like it's not completely insolvable, and then thinking that there are a lot of good arguments on the other side, so that it can outweigh the significance of the problem of evil.
So how did some other, I want to eventually get to some of your arguments if we could talk about this. How did like other potential arguments for theism play a role? Like, did they just sit on the sidelines and they don't matter? Like, what do you think about like the ontological argument for God, or the cosmological argument, or other sorts of arguments that people might present?
So I don't like most of them. I guess I can describe like the moral argument. I think it's a complete failure. I think that there's just no justification. Well, actually, you would accept it if there is no God, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. But I don't think that anyone inclined to accept moral realism should accept that premise. I don't think that God has any special advantage in grounding the existence of moral facts, rather than some atheistic foundation for the moral facts. I think it's necessarily worse because you have to posit you should do what corresponds to God's character, and then God's character is such that it contains all the moral facts, so you just have to posit an extra fact. You then don't get this parsimonious explanation of the various features of God's character. So like, I think you can explain why God is loving by the fact that love is good. But if you think that the fact that love is good is grounded in God's character, then you can't explain the fact that God is loving with God's character. Otherwise, the explanation is circular. So I think that's just a failed argument. The Kalam and various other cosmological arguments, I've never been that moved by them. I think, I think if you read James Fodor's book, Unreasonable Faith, I think he has a lot of good objections to it. Where, first of all, I don't accept the first premise that everything which begins to exist has a cause. I think, particularly if you accept the B theory of time, then there's nothing mysterious about this sort of static temporal block. And I think that the way Craig frames it is very misleading, where he talks about, universes popping into being out of nothing. But really, it's not things popping into being out of nothing. It's just them not coming from anything. So it's not like there was nothing that was sitting around in this state for a while and then poof, a universe popped into being. It's just that there was a universe and there wasn't anything before it. And then I also, I think the second premise about how the universe began to exist, I'm sort of sympathetic to views. I think Linford talks about how there are some views according to which time emerges from something else. And so if you have a view like that, then you can have this picture of how without God, you get sort of the beginning of time. So I've never been that moved by the Kalam. In regards to the ontological argument, I do think the contingency argument's a decent argument. I think, actually, let me go back to the Kalam for a second. I think it's one of those arguments where it relies on a lot of controversial assumptions, and I'm not very sure about any of the assumptions. So I think if you're convinced by all the assumptions, then it should be a good argument for you. But I'm not convinced about a lot of them. So it's like if you accept these three things, then you get a good argument for God. And I'm unsure about those three things. The contingency argument, I think it's a fine argument. The contingency argument, for those who don't know, that's the one that says that so a contingent thing is something that could have been otherwise. It says that the existence of contingent things requires an explanation and can't be explained in terms of other contingent things, because then those contingent things need an explanation. There has to be a necessary being, and then it argues that necessary being is God. I think that this is a decent argument. I'm less sure about the first premise, that so generally they'll establish first that there's a necessary thing, and then that necessary thing is God. I'm not that certain about either of them, but I think there's a good case to be made that if there's a necessary being that causes the universe, that it's God, for the reason that for any possible, if the principle of sufficient reason is true, it says everything needs an explanation, then whatever the initial thing is has to be able to bring about any metaphysically possible world. And so then it has to be omnipotent, because omnipotence just is the ability to bring about every possible world, right? So like, for example, Graham Oppy has a view where he says that the initial thing is this necessary singularity. But if you think it's just this necessary singularity, then a world with different laws of physics is metaphysically impossible because, the thing that's necessary is the singularity. There's no way that the singularity could bring about this different law of physics. So different laws of physics are metaphysically impossible. But they don't seem metaphysically impossible. It seems like the laws of physics could have been different. And so you need something that has the ability to bring about any possible world in order for to explain contingency. So yeah. So for that reason, the first thing has to be omnipotent, and then it has to be God, because God is just an omnipotent being. You asked about the ontological argument, and I guess after this I'll stop boring you with my analysis of different theistic arguments. The ontological argument, I think the original version from Anselm is just a complete failure, and I think the version from Plantinga about God possibly exists, it sounds very modest, but really it's obviously question begging, because if you say a necessary thing possibly exists, then you're just saying it exists. I do think there's one version that I'm not sure if it works, which is the Gödelian ontological argument. That one, I won't go into the details, but for a lot of these, they don't move me that much, because I think you could be convinced by them if you accept a lot of controversial things, but I'm not that sold on any of those controversial things. So I think they're interesting, but I'm not that sold on them.
Well, I would wonder whether then the reason for the three arguments that you do endorse, is it in part because the premises of those arguments are less controversial? They're more the sort of thing you think a reasonable person should accept or couldn't reasonably reject?
Well, so it's not necessarily about whether they're I mean, it's not that they're very controversial. It's more that I'm very convinced of them. And I mean, for some of them, I don't think they rely on anything. Like, I don't think the fine-tuning argument relies on anything controversial. I think the anthropic argument relies on just one controversial thing, which there are very strong arguments for. And then the psychophysical harmony argument, it relies on, the falsity of type A physicalism. But, there aren't that many type A physicalists. And I think that type A physicalism is very implausible.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hold a view similar to, like, my view would be somewhere in the illusionist camp or something like that. This is probably getting ahead of ourselves, but I wouldn't call myself a type A physicalist. I don't think you have to be a type A physicalist to reject that there are qualia or phenomenal states or that sort of thing.
I'd say you're a type A physicalist. Why wouldn't
but
you
I'm
be?
not, though.
Sorry, so why wouldn't you be a type A physicalist?
Well, I'm not a physicalist at all.
What?
Well, give me a description of physicalism. I'll tell you if I endorse it.
Well, it's kind of hard to define things like this.
That's one of my problems with it.
But I think physicalism in relation to consciousness is the idea that the features of consciousness all are explained by the fundamental, like, constituent physical things like atoms and stuff, whatever the most fundamental physical thing is, like quarks or whatever, that those suffice to fully explain consciousness, where there's nothing more about consciousness over and above that. So it's not like there are these extra laws that make consciousness arise in response to certain physical things.
I don't know if I would endorse that or not, but I don't think that would entail that one's a physicalist.
Well, I think generally when people talk about type A physicalism, they're talking about type A physicalism about consciousness. So you could be a non-physicalist about lots of other things, but if you think that consciousness is this purely physical thing, where, as Searle says, it's nothing more.
See, I would have questions like, sorry for the freezing. I have a question about what it would mean for things to, like, I don't think things are physical. Like, if you ask me something like, hey, do you think physics provides a good explanation of things at a certain level of explanation? I would say yes to that. And there might be a certain sense in which certain types of phenomena are at a certain level of description composed of or reducible to facts as they are described by physics. I might also agree to that. But I don't think that there's like physical stuff and that things are made out of the stuff of physics, for instance. So when a lot of people describe physicalism, to me, it seems to be playing a metaphysical game of counting substances that I don't endorse at all. I don't think there's one type of substance rather than another or rather than two. I just don't really, I'm not really part of any sort of discourse in which I would endorse there being one or more like types of things that have a particular nature or character.
Yeah, well, so I think, I mean, we can get into the semantics of classifying your view, but it's not that interesting of a question. But I mean, basically, you don't think that you're not a dualist. You don't think there are these extra psychophysical laws.
Right. Yeah, there's a
okay.
lot of things I'm not, but that says a little bit less about what that says I am. I don't find that not interesting, because I think when we start getting into why one would want to exit the conversation of a particular sort of ongoing stream of metaphysical dialogue that's taking place in a particular sort of philosophical bubble, the reasons for that I think could be quite interesting, because they get into exactly what does interest me, which are these foundational metaphilosophical differences between you and I, which I think is really the root difference between our perspectives.
Yeah, that might be. I guess. I mean, I've lost a bit of interest in both arguments about moral realism and consciousness. And I'd be happy to talk about them with you. But the problem is, what I've learned is that you never get anywhere with them unless you're talking to lay people, because people, they've already, on account of there being like two arguments on both sides, everyone's already heard the argument. They already have responses to the argument. It's just, I find like like all the non-physicalist arguments are kind of similar. They're just trying to get you to have this core intuition that there's a distinction between the mental and the physical. I find, I think it's much easier to convince people about topics like the self-indication assumption or ethics, where there's a whole bunch of different arguments that you can make, and you can compare a lot of different pieces of reasoning, than when it's just sort of retreading ground that's been tread 100 times. But I guess, that might just be like a personality difference between you and I.
Could be. Yeah. I tend to get sort of dig my heels in particular topics and just keep going at them for extraordinarily long periods of time. So that could be a dispositional difference. But yeah, I mean, I actually share the frustration, because like when you're framing this, like basically I'm getting the sense from your framing that like theism provides the arguments about whether God exists or not is this wide open dialectical vista where like you could go over here and play with these arguments, you could go over there and play with those arguments. There's lots of room to maneuver. Whereas some disputes, like the dispute between realists and anti-realists, it's just like people playing rock, paper, scissors over and over and over, or tic-tac-toe over and over and over. One team's X, one team's O's, and they're just going to make the same moves every damn time. And it's always going to happen, if they play the game well, that it ends in a draw over and over and over. And by the 1,000th iteration of a tic-tac-toe game between two perfect players, like what is the damn point? No one's going to win. Is that how it seems to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could totally resonate with that. But no, why do you think that I don't sit there going argument from disagreement, Mackey's arguments, this kind of argument? I don't do that. I think that the way to move forward is to take a few steps back and say, hold up, how did this exchange end up in a tic-tac-toe situation? And this is why my interests have shifted towards the sort of history and sociology of contemporary analytic philosophy. Like I'm interested in like, what the heck happened in 20th century metaethics where everyone became obsessed with analyzing sentences? Something funny is going on there. And what the heck happened with this particular discourse about consciousness? When did this arise? And that's pushed me into somewhat deeper issues, which is all this metaphilosophical and methodological talk about intuitions. And I think if we could get a handle on all that stuff, that can help us I guess you could say the more concrete stuff. It's weird to talk about even more concrete in philosophy when we're dealing with such abstract questions. But what I think is going on with a lot of these philosophical impasses is that the tools and methods that philosophers are using are not sufficient for the job. That isn't to say they're useless. It's not like I think people reasoning about like logical consistency or using syllogisms or working through deductive arguments is a complete waste of time and totally worthless. Instead, my concern is that philosophers throughout the 20th century, in an effort to carve a distinct and autonomous discipline for themselves, have started to sort of partition themselves from the sciences in a way that leaves them without the broad methodological resources to do philosophy in as holistic a way as they could be doing it. And that were they to do that, they would be able to make more philosophical progress. I'm currently working my way through an article from Susan Hack. I think it's like the fragmentation. It's something about the fragmentation of philosophy. I can't remember the title. But what she talks about in that article is how her approach to philosophy is very holistic. and she encountered a student that was like, I study this narrow area and this narrow thing about this narrow topic. And the article focuses on how the hyperspecialization in the past few decades of academic philosophy has led philosophers' areas of specialization to become disconnected from others. And the sort of the byproduct of this is that philosophers are failing to think about the connections between philosophy in one area and a broader number of areas, but also between philosophy and outside of philosophy and the sciences. Maybe this would be less true in philosophy of religion, which may give it some advantages and greater tractability, but it may be more true in certain other areas like metaethics and like consciousness.
Yeah. I mean, so I agree that I think we have some methodological differences. I mean, the one problem is that I think that these discussions about philosophical methodology are like, they're one of those, they're one of the areas that of sort of ground in the realism versus anti-realism debates that gets retreaded, and that I just think, you never get anywhere, where, it's not this, as you said, wide open vista where, I mean, like, the reason I trust, the arguments for trusting intuitions are like, if you don't trust intuitions, then, you're in crazy skeptic land. And then you say, oh, but there are all these cases of intuitions being like, I don't know. I I've never found like there to be a case of arguing about intuitions versus uh uh about of arguing about how much we should trust the intuitions and so on and so forth, where I felt like, you get somewhere. And maybe I'm just sort of pessimistic about that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, sort of when I was younger, when I was a wee lad, all those 2 years ago, I was very interested in arguing about moral realism and so on. But yeah, I've grown less interested in the topics where, like, I feel like all the arguments on both sides are things you've heard before whenever you're discussing them, where just I think it's unlikely that you'll make very much progress. And I've grown more interested in the topics like anthropics, like utilitarianism, where there are just like a million arguments on both sides that can be made.
Yeah, I think you may be underselling the substance behind methodological and metaphilosophical disputes. I mean, you'll rarely just see like sometimes people think that I'm against intuitions in some crude sense. Like you do get this sort of crude. Well, intuitions are sometimes unreliable, so we shouldn't trust them. Kind of argument. I don't. I hope you'll never catch me saying something like that because it's a very silly thing to say. Like vision is sometimes unreliable, so I guess I don't have hands in front of me. Like what? And I'm not justified in believing I got hands right here. I mean, it's very silly. Oh, hey, I guess I just pulled a Moore without realizing it. So, so it's that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something where I think that the degree of space to move in is really, really broad and open. It's not just are intuitions reliable or not. There's a whole range of metaphilosophical disputes that I think are substantive and interesting and worth discussing. It would be hard to point to a specific literature, but like for instance, I don't even know how it would categorize this paper from Hack on the fragmentation of philosophy. It's like a commentary on the state of academic philosophy. What branch of philosophy does that fall into? I don't know. But it's an interesting and I think insightful paper. And it's the sort of paper that when I read it, it makes me take a step back and understand that when you and I are discussing these topics, we're discussing them within particular sorts of paradigms or frameworks that can be, in virtue of the methods and tools within those frameworks, can allow us to make progress. Same way, if you're working within like contemporary biology, you can make progress in biology, or contemporary chemistry, you make progress within chemistry. Maybe we can make progress within here, but at the same time, there's this canalization, this narrowing of what one pays attention to and what sorts of tools one has. It's kind of like there's this whole toolkit out there, and you and I are grabbing 2 or 3 tools, whatever we could carry in our hands, and we're going to try to solve everything with those tools. And that's what I see going on with philosophy, where we are sort of impairing ourselves and then thinking that that's the best way to go forward. And I think that if you take a step back and ask, what are we doing here and how are we doing it? There's a lot of interesting questions there. It's not confined to, are intuitions reliable?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree. There are lots of interesting metaphilosophical, like topics, like, yeah, the fragmentation of philosophy is that interesting. I guess I don't know. I don't know if there are that many that are that relevant to my dispute with you. Where like it really seems like the reason why we disagree is that basically on a lot of these subjects like moral realism and uh, uh, you know dualism about consciousness is we both agree that sort of if you have a very strong intuition, generally you have some solid justification for believing something. And then I think, yeah, I actually have a really strong intuition about a lot of particular things, like the presence of objective morality, the presence of certain judgments that the moral anti-realist can't affirm, I think. Uh, and you do not have those intuitions, and you find the claims that the intuitions are based on to be confusing or bizarre, right? So, I mean, I don't, I guess, are there areas where you think we have like major metaphilosophical differences that you think inform our first order differences?
I suspect that there are, but that we're not going to find them if we don't look and talk about them. So, it could
Sure. I mean,
be
we can
like
talk
my
about that.
framing of the way you've described this is we've got different priors. And so it could be no matter what we do, at least on certain topics, we're going to end up in a different place at the end of the inquiry. So, if I start with a credence of like asymptotically approaching one on a topic and you approach it from a 0.5 or a 0.2 or a 0.00001, and then we look at the same body of evidence, there's only a finite amount of evidence like human brains can handle. We're going to end up reaching different conclusions. I'm going to be stuck where I'm at, and you're going to potentially change your mind, and this could flip for some other topic where I can change and you may not. And so if it comes down to us just being like as a matter of descriptive fact, we just have different initial starting points, like different priors. We're just going to be incorrigible, conditional on some finite body of evidence in a way that is uninteresting and kind of a bummer. It's just like we got the
Yeah.
same evidence, but I'm super convinced of A and you're super convinced of not A. Okay, so we're still convinced of A and not A. Bye. Like that's not a fun discussion. There's nothing can come of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I like, and that's, that's why I like theism or thinking about theism and thinking about various areas where I think there are a lot of areas where I think, yeah, just the main differences are people have different philosophical starting points. Where I mean, there are some people who are like, I think I've Jonas Olson. I think he's like very convinced by the argument from queerness against moral realism. So maybe for him, if you're talking with him, you could have like, it wouldn't just depend on different priors because I think he finds moral realism intuitive. But yeah, I think it's just sort of a depressing fact about the world that just a lot of our disagreements come from having very different priors and from having very different just intuitions about things. And so, that makes people, very dramatically disagree about a lot of stuff.
I do wonder though whether those foundations can shift. Like people do change their mind on a variety of issues in philosophy, and it could be that if one could shift one's metaphilosophical views, everything else would shift. Like it would be like a intellectual domino effect where they would start seeing everything in a new light, and that could potentially change their downstream views quite a bit. I don't
Could
know.
be. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd be happy to discuss if you have any, if there's any feature of meta philosophy that you'd like to discuss. Happy to do it.
It maybe, but I think we should veer back towards the theism stuff. So what I was curious about, I had one thing I was curious about on the theism stuff, but then maybe it would just make sense to talk about the three arguments that
Sure.
convinced you. Because I think that that's what we're here to talk about, right?
Sure.
Yeah, maybe meta philosophy. I mean, this is up to you. Like,
Yeah, happy to do either. Yeah, we
okay.
could talk about the theism argument.
So before we get to that, and I heard you say a little bit about your views on the kind of theism you endorse, and I also saw a comment in the chat earlier where someone's like, "Theism, what's being discussed here is a bit vague." Do you think you could say a bit about the kind, like what you think God is, or the kind of God you believe in? Like flesh it out a bit. Like, is this a perfect being? Are they all good? Are they like what are their properties?
I think there's a perfect being that made the universe.
So, can you say a bit more about that? Like, perfect. Like, are they omnibenevolent, omniscient?
Yeah, I think they're omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. I lean towards the view that they're timeless, though I'm less certain of that. I think they're uncaused. Uh, I think they're in some sense infinitely better than anything that is not them. But that one I'm less sure about. And there's because maybe that gets into weird metaphysics, but yeah.
And how does this God relate to any that freezing is driving me nuts. So you're not like a Christian. You don't identify with any specific religion or anything like that, right?
No.
Do you think? Do you think some religions are more like? I'm assuming so, but like, like if you were, what credence do you put in like some type of Christianity being true?
Maybe like 15%.
And then like other religions, what about like Hinduism
I think
or
so. I think the
Islam?
order of religions, and I can try to put probabilities on them, but it would go Christianity, Hinduism. After that, I don't know. Maybe like Mormonism, maybe, though I don't know. Maybe Mormonism's really. I haven't looked into it carefully. Yeah, maybe not Mormonism. Then like I think Judaism and Islam rank pretty low, because the problem with Judaism is that there are no good arguments for it. And the problem for Islam is that there are no good arguments for it and lots of good arguments against it. Where like the Quran, it's supposed to be the word directly from God. And then it has God apparently saying all these like horrible and false things, which I wouldn't expect God to do that if he was speaking directly. Where if you're a Christian, you can say, well, there are all these human errors in the book, which is why I think things went wrong. Maybe it's inspired in some broad sense, but it went wrong in a lot of ways. But if you're a Muslim and you think God was essentially dictating the Quran directly, the Quran does not look like a dictation from God.
Okay. And what about other aspects of your views? Like, are there souls? Is there an afterlife? Is there in the afterlife? Is there like a good place and a bad place people go? Like, what are the other components of this worldview?
Yeah, I think there are souls, though I think that for reasons independent of theism. And I thought that when I was an atheist for a few months before becoming a theist. I think that there are, there is an afterlife, I think. And the third question was, is there a good place and a bad place? I think just a good place. I don't know why God would like make people go to a bad place. Seems bad.
Okay, so if you were a Christian, you'd be some kind of universalist or something.
Yeah. I would definitely be a universalist if I were a Christian. And I actually think that, and I did a kind of weirdly deep dive on this topic. I actually think that Christians, just even if they like didn't have any moral intuitions about this, just from reading the Bible, should be universalists. Where, like, for example, if there are all these verses about how, for example, Lamentations says no one is cast off by the Lord forever. I think in Romans it says, as in Adam all died, so in Christ all will be made alive. It says every knee will bow and every tongue will confess, but the words for bow and confess are more like, the word for confess is, I think, exomologiomai, which is more like lovingly praise. And the word for bow is campo, which means religious veneration. Like, there are all these verses that I think are very suggestive of universalism. And then the verses that allegedly undermine universalism, I think generally are just them translating the word aionios as eternal, when aionios doesn't always mean eternal, and it often doesn't. And so, I don't think, I think that just on purely scriptural grounds, a Christian should be a universalist. And then they should also be a universalist because it's obviously way more philosophically defensible.
Also, conveniently, would be a lot nicer if it were true. Which is, if it were true, if Christianity were true, I would sure as hell hope that's true. So I take it like, would you take eternal conscious torment to be like scripturally indefensible and like philosophically indefensible?
Yeah.
And what about just annihilationism?
I would think that's also scripturally and philosophically indefensible.
Okay.
I mean, cool. Why would a perfect being just like snuff out people when he could allow them to continue existing and living good lives in perpetuity?
So
we generally think that murdering someone is wrong. Okay. And you shouldn't do it unless you have a good reason. Like, you shouldn't kill someone. You shouldn't make them stop existing. And so, if it's wrong to cause a person to stop existing, then God would not cause most people to stop existing absent a really good reason. And he does.
Yeah, I don't know how much I want to get into that, because I'm not here to defend the Christian view. Maybe you already do this, but are you planning to discuss like why you're a theist but not a Christian with Christians and see how your views butt up against their perspective?
Yeah, I've already done that with some Christians. Like in the last week or so, I had Lydia McGrew on the channel. And I've spoken with Gavin Ortland. I spoke with Mike Lacona. I spoke with Trent Horn about this. I plan to talk with other Christians about it.
Do you think that's a direction you might move into, or are you confident that like Christianity's off the table?
I mean, maybe I'd move into it. It would just depend on my assessment of the evidence. Though I don't think like lots of people have been saying, oh, first theism, then Christianity. That's the way the things are going to go. And I don't think that that's very obvious, because if you look at the sort of trajectory of my credence in theism over time, you could predict that it would keep going up just by linear extrapolation, where the trend was doop, doop, and then just keep going up. Well, with Christianity, basically, since I became pretty convinced of theism, my credence has been around 15%, and it's basically stayed there.
15% is pretty dang high. Like
15.
I don't know. My credence would be what, 1 in a million? Like it would be maybe lower.
Yeah. So I said, did you say 50? I said 15.
15. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's somewhat high.
Yeah, I do worry about this because of like a lot of people appending percentages to things. I always feel like if I do it, I'm BSing and I don't really have a percentage in mind. Maybe I would be more confident if I did it more frequently. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you get accused of that, but I don't think it really is BSing, where it's like, so just imagine, you could just imagine someone would offer you $1 million. They give you this deal where they're like, okay, I'll either give you $1 million with 15% odds, or $1 million with if Christianity is true. The lowest percentage at which you'd take the deal, that's, I think, what your credence is.
Oh, yeah. I'm familiar with putting this in monetary terms and then getting a sense of, would I take that bet? No. Would I take that bet? You add another dollar to, or percentage. And there's a certain point where I'd flip and then go, yeah, I take that bet. And I think that's fine. It's kind of like if someone says, hey, would you do this ridiculous or horrible thing for $1,000? You're like, no. What about $5,000? If you just, instead of it being the ridiculous thing being held static, it's some percentage bet on the thing turning out to be true, I can kind of put myself in that mind space. So I don't have a huge problem with it, but I don't do it a lot myself, and I feel silly when I do it. And maybe I would feel less silly if I thought through that money exercise. I still worry about it sometimes, though.
Yeah. It does feel a little silly. Like you sort of seem like a nerd. It's like, oh, I assign 31.25% odds. But I don't know. Scott Alexander has some good articles about why this is a good exercise, where generally if a person asks you, oh, what do you think about Christianity? Lots of people will give answers like, oh, I think it's probably false, but maybe it's true. That's just way less precise and communicates way less information than if you say, yeah, I think 15% odds that it's right.
Yeah, I worry that there's benefits and costs to doing this, where if we over mathematize our thinking in ways that are too specific, you could get it. Because I think it would be silly if someone said, I think there's a 14.861% chance that God exists or something like that, or Christianity is true. I would hope that you would appreciate why one might be wary.
Yeah, that would be a little, I think you just want to get a general sense, I think beyond a certain point, it's really you actually have the mental state corresponding to you've actually thought through whether it's 14.21 or 22 or something, which of those you would actually take the bet on. But yeah, I think it is helpful to just know, okay, is this person, if the person says, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's false. Okay, does that mean they're 95% sure that it's false, or that they're 70% sure that it's false? I think it's there's something valuable about being precise, because you just can communicate more about a person's view.
Okay, fair. I feel like there's...
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I feel like there's more I could say to express concern about this. For instance, a disposition to take bets, people could vary even if they have similar epistemic evaluations of a scenario, just because one person's more risk averse or something. And then
the idea is you're supposed to imagine the bet case that you're not at all risk averse.
Right, but I don't know how good people are at doing that.
Yeah.
Because if you ask me, imagine what it's like not to be a very anxious person and then go do what would you do? I don't know. I'm an anxious person. I don't know how to think about that. There's lots of stuff someone could ask me to do. I don't know how to do it. I could imagine that it in some very fuzzy sense, but I don't think there's not much meat on that conception.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing that I think makes it more interesting to think about is, or more valuable to engage in this exercise, is if you look at the people who are best at forecasting events, like the super forecasters, they think about a lot of things in terms of probabilities. And so I want to be like those guys.
Sure, yeah, and they actually predict better than the rest of us, do they not?
Yeah, yeah.
So, well, they're all going to get beat by ChatGPT soon enough if they haven't already. So, uh, I don't. They're not going to do better than the machines, which are going to win. How? This is a total aside, but where are you at with the whole AI risk thing? Do you think like would you have a credence on how likely it is that like AGI is going to wipe us all out?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe like 2%. Like, I think it's a big deal. I think we should be pretty kind of worried. But I think the arguments for it are like not great for it being a big risk or not crazy. But I'm not one of the people who's like, yeah, we're completely doomed. No shot that we survive. I think we'll probably get through it, but maybe we're doomed. I don't know.
Okay, that's fair. So, sorry for the sidetrack. It just occurred to me, and I was curious. Should we get into the arguments? I don't know if we can make much headway on them. Maybe on the ones other than psychophysical harmony, where I feel like we'll hit an immediate impasse.
Yeah. Maybe we could end with psychophysical harmony, but I do think discussing the other ones would be more interesting. Maybe let's do the anthropic argument first, because that one's my favorite.
Okay. Yeah, I may not have much to say about this because you may just present some premise or claim to me, and I'll go, I don't know. But let's flesh that one out a bit more.
So the idea of the anthropic argument, remember the self-indication assumption, that's the view that says that from the fact that you exist, you should think there are more people that exist. And so if you accept the self-indication assumption, well, I think there's at least a plausible story on which God would make every possible person, or maybe you think it's impossible for him to make every possible person, but he would at least make the cardinality of people he would make would equal the cardinality of the number of possible people. So the cardinality is the size of an infinite set. Some infinites are bigger than others. So let's say so the smallest infinite is Beth 0, then Beth 1 is bigger than that, then Beth 2 is bigger than that. And so the number of possible people is at least Beth 2, as I think David Lewis convincingly showed. And so if there are Beth 2 possible people, then from the fact that you exist, I think you get infinitely strong evidence that there are at least Beth 2 actual people. And then theism is just the best explanation of that fact. God would be decently likely to create Beth 2 actual people, given that there's something valuable about creating a person and he has no reason to stop. Well, on atheism, it's very implausible that there would be Beth 2 actual people. There isn't a plausible naturalistic story about how you get that. If you look at the naturalistic multiverse models, they all get at most Beth 0 people. Like if space is infinitely big, that would only have Beth 0 people. So that's the basic argument. You exist. The self-indication assumption is true, which means from the fact that you exist, you should think that more people existing is likely. From that, you should think that the number of people that exist is the most that it could be. And then theism is the best explanation of why the number of people that exists is the most that it could be.
Okay, there's lots I might have to ask about here. Can you walk me through this, like through the steps of this? So like, because I feel like there's a lot for me to float in my head at once. And at least a couple concerns jumped out at me. One would be like why like a multiverse view would only have this like lower infinity. And the other would be, what if on average the kinds of lives beings live is net negative? Then that seems like it would be bad for there to be more people, not good.
Yeah, so I don't think God would make all beings, even the ones with negative lives. But the idea is just God would make every being. So part of this will get into a bit of your views of personal identity. So I think God would make every possible person, but he would just give them all good lives. And if you think that a person is a soul or something, then this is possible. Like to deny this, you have to think there's something like a robust essence or something. But we don't even need to get into that because, maybe God would only make the people who he could give a good life to. But that means that there are more people that exist. That raises the probability that I would exist out of the infinite number of possible people. In particular, because, I think I'm a person who, with the power of God, could be given a good life. I assume you think that as well, particularly if we take into account the possibility of an infinite afterlife.
Okay, but like right now, my life is not great. And if I look out at the world and I look at the history of life on Earth, it looks to me like most humans and non-human animals that are presumptively conscious have had probably on average negative, like bad lives. Do you agree with that? And is that just not relevant to the consideration here?
I do agree with that, and I don't think it's relevant to the consideration because what matters isn't whether the beings have good lives during their time on Earth, but what matters is whether the being's total existence will be good. And if God
Right.
can give
Okay.
them an infinitely good afterlife, then even if the squirrel lives a few days and dies painfully, if they have an infinitely good afterlife, overall their life is worth living.
Okay. And so, is there a reason? So, I'm looking at the world right now, and given my the rest of my views, and then maybe some of the considerations here would work around this and lead me to think maybe my views about that are wrong. But looks to me like the squirrels just die and then that's it. So it sure doesn't seem to me like we're gonna get these like extra super long afterlives. Like on your view, to like squirrels and non-human animals, like do they get afterlives too?
Yep.
Okay, so how would I get to this view from where I'm currently? Like I'm looking at things, I'm like, huh, just looks like there's the one planet I know about with people on it, and animals, and it kind of sucks. So
Well,
how do I get to like it's actually it is or would be great in the long run or something?
Well, the idea is from the fact that you exist, you get infinitely strong evidence that infinite people exist. Then from that, you conclude that God exists. And then from that, you conclude that the beings have a good afterlife.
Because I exist, the self-indication assumption would lead me to think that there's like an infinite number of people exist, some type of infinity.
Yeah.
Okay, and then how do you get from that to God?
Well, so if there's not just infinite people, but a very large set of infinite people, a set that it's very difficult to see how you get that on naturalism and and all the coherent naturalistic models. Like just to give you a sense of how big Beth 2 is, which is a lower bound on the number of possible people, and I actually think it's way more than this. The number of natural numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's Beth 0. Beth 1 is the number of real numbers. So, uh, which includes, for example, infinite non-repeating decimals. Beth 2 is way bigger than that. And so if it's very difficult to get a coherent naturalistic model of how you get Beth 2 people. And I think there's a reason, there's a slightly technical reason for why I don't think there could be a coherent one to get Beth 2 people without it being very complicated. Because so to avoid the theory being complicated, what you want to have is you want to have some simple mechanism that generates a bunch of universes. Okay. So you say, there's this physical system that generates a universe when it does this, and then poof, you get a bunch of universes. Now, the number of possible sentences is Aleph null. Okay. Or is Beth 0. Beth 0 and Aleph null are equal, for the record. So the number of possible sentences is Beth 0. And so for every universe that it generates, there's just a possible sentence that says that universe was generated where you describe the universe. And so if that's right, then, or at least for every simple universe that it generates. And so if that's right, then for any simple multiverse model where you have some system that makes a bunch of universes, you can only get at most Beth 0 universes, not Beth 2. And so
Can you have a more complicated multiverse model where you get higher Beths?
Yeah, right. So you could, in theory, have here's a multiverse model you could have. Maybe you think there's a machine. There's just a button, and when the button's pressed, it creates Beth 2 universes. You could have that. The problem is that would undermine simplicity because it would undermine simplicity because built into the fundamental thing is this capacity to generate a bunch of universes. So that wouldn't be any simpler than just saying there are Beth 2 universes for no reason. There's just this thing that just generates Beth 2 universes. What you want is some system that can be simply described, that's sort of simple and non-arbitrary, that naturally generates Beth 2 universes. That's sort of what you want out of a good multiverse model. But then there isn't a viable way of getting from that to Beth 2 universes. The other point is that I actually think, and we can get into the reasons to think this if you want, but I don't think that the number of possible people is just Beth 2. I think that it's so Beth 2 and Beth 1 and so on, these are the size of infinite sets, but there are some infinites that are bigger than any set. So for example, the class of all sets, the class of the collection is sort of like a collection that's formally defined. The class of all sets is bigger than any set could be because it just for any set of any size, it contains that set plus a set bigger than it. So the class of all sets is bigger than any set could be. Similarly, there's no set of all truths. And so I think that the number of possible people is unsettly many that there can't even be a coherent set of it. And if that's true, then it's very hard to see how you get a multiverse model, because for any multiverse model, it seems like you can just construct a set out of the things that it makes. Where like the only way to get around this is to believe something like modal realism, where you think every possible world exists. But I think those views are going to have problems.
What's wrong with those views? I don't endorse those views, but why not go with just a modal realism?
So a few things. First of all, I think even if you did think they didn't have any like core problems, it would still just be a very convincing argument for theism, where if you just knock out all the naturalistic competitors other than modal realism, that raises the probability of theism a lot. Like if you knock out 99% of the ways theism could be true, that would be a good argument. Second of all, I think modal realism undermines induction, because on modal realism, for every world where things continue according to normal, there are just a bunch of worlds where things just catastrophically implode in a variety of creative ways. Like there's a possible world exactly like ours up until this point, but where we all turn into a unicorn 1 second from now. And so then the vast majority of people with our current evidence end up imploding 1 second from now in some dramatic way. And so if you know that, then you shouldn't trust induction. If you know that the vast majority of people with your current evidence up until this point have sort of like induction be undermined 1 second from now, then you should think induction will be undermined in this world, because we have no evidence that we're in one of the special non-inductive worlds.
Well, maybe we should just think induction doesn't work in this world. Like, that's that phrase that people say, like, one philosopher's modus tollens is another's modus tollens. So you could just go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I guess I'm inclined to think that you shouldn't give up on induction unless you have a really good reason to. Like, you should think the sun will rise tomorrow. And I also think that, and this gets a little bit trickier to describe, but the basic idea is, so imagine modal realism and theism both predict every possible person comes to exist. Well, modal realism predicts that the vast majority of possible people who come to exist, given that for each second induction could fail in some way, it predicts that induction would have failed at some point in the past, and we wouldn't have gotten to this point. Well, theism predicts with higher probability that we would have gotten to this point.
Sorry, maybe I didn't follow that. Can you say that again?
So the idea is, once you have all possible people made, then induction, like let's say that we're at time 1 million. Let's say we're 1 million seconds into the world. Well, for every second that passes, modal realism predicts probably the world will collapse at some point. And so on modal realism, the odds that you in particular would have survived up until this point is very low. While in theism, it's higher because theism predicts induction.
Okay, I don't know how to assess any of this because it's so far outside the areas that I look at things. I am curious about this because it's the kind of case where I know so little about the topic. I just have to ask questions like, well, what do other experts think about this? So one thing about this would be, you're telling me that the naturalist accounts can't get the job done and theism can. Would this be generally accepted by other people that work on the topic? Like what would like Max Tegmark say about this? Like, are there no naturalist models that would say, we could handle this just fine. We could get enough universes on the table to reach the same amount of people as on your view?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, there are only 2 non-theistic models of ultimate reality that have ever been proposed that get you best 2 people, which are modal realism. And actually, ironic, it's funny you mentioned Tegmark. Tegmark's view that every mathematical function is instantiated somewhere. But I think those both undermine induction. But yeah, I mean, if you just look at the sort of like standard model of how you get a multiverse, they don't get best 2 people. And you can sort of see why they don't get best 2 people when you just think about how big best 2 is. Like, it's more than the number of numbers. Once you have something that's more than the number of numbers, you need some really creative and gerrymandered process to bring it about.
Maybe you don't. Maybe this is something that could be explored. I mean, I know somebody that endorses a view like Tegmark's, and I suspect they'd have quite a bit to say if they were told that their view is less plausible than theism. I don't think that they would agree with that. Otherwise, I think they'd be a theist. So
yeah, right. So I agree that. Yeah, so I think there are a few views. Well, 2 in particular: modal realism and Tegmark's view. And it's not clear if Tegmark's view gets you enough people. I actually don't know. Maybe I'll ask one of my friends who knows the math better. I don't know if it gets you and it'll depend on. I think it gets you at least Beth2 people, but I don't know if it gets you unsettly many people. But anyways, but it's not true that every view implies it, right? So I think modal realism and the Tegmark view, those are both get Beth2 people, if not more. But I think for other naturalistic views, like if you just have a standard multiverse, that view will won't get you enough people. I think, in short, I think there's no simple way to get a process that naturally generates Beth2 people. So you just have to build into the theory that the universes just exist. Now, in order to make that plausible and parsimonious, what you want to do is say, well, okay, yes, the universes just exist, but there's a principled explanation of why the universes exist, namely that the universes are certain mathematical structures and that all mathematical structures exist. And then that's sort of parsimonious. It doesn't have any limits, or all possible worlds exist. Yeah, that's sort of parsimonious. It doesn't have any arbitrary limits. But I don't see a way of doing that unless you have a view like that, or like theism, where you just say there just exist these things with the power to bring about uncountably infinite universes. Like if you just have a simple physical mechanism, that's not going to get you any more than Aleph null universes at most. Sorry, can I just run to the restroom very quickly?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay, I'm back.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Yeah. So when I look at this stuff, I have to approach everything with a kind of like, that's interesting, but I would have no idea unless I went and read the books and looked at the arguments. So for where I'm at, I'm just sort of unable to evaluate these sorts of considerations because I just lack sufficient knowledge. Like I don't know anything about these numbers of infinities. So I don't know what I can do with respect to these arguments other than to sort of very superficially engage with them and then maybe think, if this is of interest to me, maybe I'll go look into it further. So I don't know if I could offer you the kind of critiques that I think would be really helpful, from someone that is more informed. So I'm just trying to just very superficially grok some of the points you're making.
Yeah, right. So, I think it's a complicated argument. You should look into it before you're like convinced of it or have a strong conclusion. I guess the things I'd recommend looking into just to get to understand the infinity stuff. I don't know. I mean, the YouTuber Vsauce has a video about the sizes of infinity that I think explains it well. Just read like the Wikipedia, like the infinity stuff I'm talking about is not that controversial or the proof that there are infinite, that there are Beth2 possible people, that one's a bit tricky. There's a paper that I linked to in my article on the subject. But yeah, I mean, I think obviously, this is not the argument where you should be convinced in like one conversation about it. Uh, uh, but yeah, I think you should. It's an interesting argument worth looking into, and hopefully you'll start believing in God soon from it.
I find it very unlikely. I mean,
Yeah, I don't
this
think
type
you
of
will.
stuff, to me, there's so much metaphysical speculation involved here that I question whether any of us is in a position to make judgments about any of this. So, from where I'm currently at, I don't see any particular reason to think that there's large numbers of people and like that are in other universes that are inaccessible to me somehow. And if someone says, "Ah, but this principle seems true," and and that would entail this, I just put that up against how things what I currently think, and I'm just like, I don't know, maybe, maybe not. I don't know what to make of that. So, if we dial it all the way back, just the self indication assumption and the implications of that, I don't know what to think about that. I am not particularly inclined to be confident that there's any particular number of people that I can determine exist based on consideration of some principle.
Yeah, well, I agree it's kind of weird, but I think you can show that if you diverge from the self-indication assumption, you get these really counterintuitive results. Okay, so here's one argument for the self-indication assumption and this is not what I think is the most convincing argument, but I think it is a pretty convincing argument. So here's a test case for the self-indication assumption to show where the self-indication assumption differs from other views. So basically, so a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, one person gets created. If it comes up tails, a billion people get created. You get created. As the self-indication assumption, it would say your credence in tails should be a billion times your credence in heads. Other views would say no, it shouldn't be. Okay, so now let's see if it should be. Well, I'm going to argue that there are four cases in total that are alike in how you should reason about them. And then the last case is the case I just gave. Okay, so the first case is, so you exist. You read a note. You come to exist in a room. You see on the board there's a note that says, this is written by your parents. What we did was we flipped a coin, and if the coin came up heads, we had sex using very effective contraception, and if the coin came up tails, we had sex without contraception. The contraception was so effective that it would mean the odds of your mother getting pregnant is 1 in a billion. While if the coin came up heads, the odds of your mother getting pregnant is, if it came up heads, then the odds are 1 in a billion. If it came up tails, then the odds are 100%. Just stipulating. I think if you come to exist, you should think, oh, the coin almost definitely came up tails, because that makes it much more likely that I would come to exist. It makes it much likelier that my mother would get pregnant. Like, from the fact that you exist, you get strong evidence that your mother did not use effective birth control in the sex act that produced you. Do you agree with that case?
I think so. I mean, I will reserve the right to recognize that I'm stupid and wrong about something, but it does seem that way.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the next case. So you come to exist. You're in a room. You read a note, and what the note says is that same setup as before. If coin got flipped. If it came up heads, one person, birth control was used. If it came up tails, then no birth control, no effective contraception was used. You came to exist. Except in this case, there's one difference, which is it wasn't just one person. It wasn't just your parents having sex. There were a billion total people who all were following this advice. So one coin got flipped. If it came up heads, one person, if it came up heads, they all used effective contraception such that only one of them would get pregnant on average. And if it came up tails, then none of them used effective contraception such that they would all get pregnant. You come to exist. You agree that now that you should think the coin almost definitely came up tails at 1 billion to 1 odds, because that makes it 1 billion times as likely that your mother in particular would get pregnant. It doesn't seem like these other people, whatever advice they're following, that doesn't seem relevant to
Right.
the odds.
Okay.
Okay. So then the third case is rather than 1 billion different people who each have sex, instead one just one couple has sex a billion times, but the setup is as before, where they flip a coin. If it comes up heads, each time they have sex, they use effective contraception. If it comes up tails, each time they use no contraception. So if they have sex a billion times and the coin came up tails, they'd have a billion kids. If it came up heads, they'd have no kids. So my thought is that in this case, your credence in the coin coming up tails should be a billion times your credence in the coming up heads. This case is relevantly like the last case. The only difference is in the last case, it was the sex acts were spread across a billion different people. In this case, it's concentrated across one person, but like that shouldn't matter in terms of your credence and you coming to exist. Like this case seems like the last case. It doesn't. Yeah, it seems like it doesn't matter if it was the sex acts were distributed across a bunch of different people or condensed into one person. Okay, and then the last case is just the case we talked about at the beginning, where a coin gets flipped, comes up heads, one person gets created, comes up tails, a billion people get created. This case is like the last case. The only difference between this case and the last case is that in this case, it's just a difference in terms of how the people get created. Right,
Okay.
but surely
So
the process shouldn't matter.
So I follow the reasoning for all of those scenarios. How does that apply to the situation we're actually in? So I take that line of reasoning and then I'm going to extrapolate from that something about the world that we're actually in.
Well, so the idea is that the explanation of why your credence in tails should be a billion times your credence in heads in the last case is that just more people existing makes your existence more likely. But then if that's true, then in the actual world, because and it has to be that, right? Because remember, the only difference between the only thing that difference between the coin coming up heads and coming up tails is that upon tails, more people get created. Okay, so from this, we learned that more people existing makes your existence more likely, and then you should think that the universe has more people because that makes your existence more likely.
How does that follow? So in this case, you specify. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just trying to understand the reasoning here. If you specify conditions like that, where you're stipulating here are the options, and it's very clear given the options that one of these is the more likely of the two. We could even get down to exactly how much more likely it is. Fair enough. But I'm looking at the world I'm actually in. How do I move from that consideration to the world I'm actually in? Because it has not been stipulated of this world that any sort of coin flip scenario, that I've got different options for coin flip scenarios that have taken place.
So the idea is that what you take away from that case is that if one theory says that a billion times as many people exist, it's a billion times as likely. And you could change the numbers around. So one of them said that a trillion times as many people exist, it would be a trillion times as likely. So that's what you take away from those series of cases, because that's the only way to explain why in the last case your credence in heads should be 1 billionth your credence in tails. And then if you accept that principle is the self-indication assumption. From that, you should think that there are a bunch of people.
I'm not yet getting it. So I'm in this world. How do I figure out that I should think there's lots of people? Like, even if I grant self-indication in those cases specifically stipulated, so like it's A or B, B is more likely than A. But in this world, what am I comparing? What's being compared to what?
So the idea is that, so from those cases, you learn that from the case I described, you learn that the self-indication assumption is true. And the reason you learn that the self-indication assumption is true from those cases, or from the case I described, is that in that case, the only explanation of why tails is a billion times likelier than heads is that more people existing is more likely, because that's the only difference between the coin coming up heads and the coin coming up tails. So that's the only difference, and that means your credence in tails should be higher than your credence in heads.
Hold up, but does that generalize? Because that sounds like that could just be a trivial, like you've stipulated a set of conditions in which a particular consideration is the only relevant consideration by stipulation in that particular scenario. But I don't know if that it follows from that there's some general principle or assumption that is entailed by accepting that in the stipulation.
Okay, well, so I think there is, because so here's an analogy. Imagine if we were talking about like let's see, what's a good analogy? So like imagine if we were arguing about whether dessert is real. Okay. Whether bad people deserve to have bad things happen. And so what I did was I said, look, here's this paradigm case. A person, tortures and murders and rapes a bunch of people, and then you can cause a bad thing to happen to them. And then I come up with this really convincing argument for why in that case you shouldn't think that a bad thing happened to them, or that a bad thing should happen to them. Well, I think that would undermine dessert, because the only explanation of why a bad thing would happen to them is that there would be dessert, but then that isn't the case, and so there isn't dessert. And so similarly in this case, the only explanation of why more people existing is more likely in this case is that, of why the coin is likelier to come up tails, is that more people existing is more likely. And it shouldn't, and there's nothing like special about the setup, right? You could imagine modifying the setup. So let's imagine, rather than a coin flip, imagine you're just evaluating different models of the universe, and one of them says there are a billion times as many people. That case seems like relevantly like the case where, let's imagine that the theories are independently equally plausible. And one of them says that that the coin coming up tails is a billion times as likely. Or sorry, one of them says that there are a billion times as many people. That case seems relevantly like the coin flip case, where in both cases, there's some event, and it has some objective probability independent of the anthropic evidence. Or like independent of the anthropic evidence, you'd be roughly indifferent. And then the anthropic evidence just makes it so that more people existing makes your existence more likely. So in short, the answer is that the explanation of why you should think that that the coin came up tails in this case is that the self-indication assumption is right, because the self-indication assumption is the only plausible view that explains why you should think that the coin coming up tails is a billion times likelier.
Yeah, see, that's I'm not sure I'm on board with that. I'm not sure that the conclusion in that case requires some generalized principle or assumption to explain it. Rather, it looks to me like the answer to the question is sort of built in or stipulated into the description in that case. And I don't know if that generalizes or applies to other cases. Like, I don't know that the universe that I am in is one according to which I should think of it as substantively analogous to that scenario, such that I should think what holds in that scenario holds in reality. That's where I'm. And again, I'm not saying you're mistaken about this. It could be that this is the sort of thing I would have to like really sit down and look at it on like look at the arguments and read over this and reflect on it to get this. But I don't want to move too quickly in thinking sounds right, so it is right. I want to have that like a eureka sense, or I'm like, okay, I do think these are analogous, but I'm not getting that sense. And I move very cautiously from abstractions to reality, and maybe too cautiously. But I'm feeling like I'm not seeing an immediate connection here.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, one way to see this is just, if you look at all the other views of anthropics other than the self-indication assumption, they would all say that your credence and heads and tails should be equal. Maybe with some, like, the self-indication assumption is basically the only view on offer that says that your credence and tails should be a billion times higher than your credence and heads. And you can just see why this is the case, which the only difference between the coin coming up heads and tails is that tails means there are more people. And that's supposed to make this very large difference. That's the fact that there are a billion times as many people existing, that makes it so that tails is a billion times likelier. And so
I'm not disputing that, but I'm not endorsing an alternative like principle. I'm questioning whether there is any principle to extract from this at all, or whether any principles or assumptions are needed to explain the scenario. Again, my concern here is that what you've set up is an artificial scenario in which it's just built into the scenario that a certain conclusion is the appropriate conclusion for that scenario. But it's not clear to me if anything of interest philosophically follows from that fact.
Yeah, the idea is that, so imagine we're trying to evaluate, okay, is it bad to cause other people just like suffering for no reason if the people are good people? Well, you could imagine just think about a case where you just press a button and it causes people suffering for no reason. In that case, you would want to say, okay, yeah, that's a good test case of the intuition, because it's just like you imagine just a case where this applies. And in this case, we're just trying to test the intuition. Okay, is more people likely? Well, let's imagine an event that's chancy, but where one event means there are more people. Should we think that's more likely? If so, then I think that serves to vindicate to vindicate the self-indication assumption. Like, if the only difference between the heads, like the basic point is that we want to come up with an explanation. Well, okay, sorry. Let me make a few points. First of all, even if your objection is right, this is the most common objection to the self-indication assumption, that it implies that in cases like this, you can be a billion times as confident in tails than in heads. And so if that's right, then even if this doesn't prove the self-indication assumption, it would still get rid of the biggest and most common objection to the self-indication assumption. Second of all, I think it does prove it. First, because it eliminates every other view of anthropics. And second, because the only explanation of why tails is a billion times as common as heads is that more people existing is more likely. If it weren't the case that more people existing is more likely, then it wouldn't be in the case where if you have a scenario where there's a chancy event where if it weren't for the more people existing, your credence should be 50-50, then the fact that it makes a billion times as many people makes it more likely. Sorry, I explained that poorly, but the basic idea is the only way to make sense of why, in this case, tails is a billion times as likely as heads is to say that the self-indication assumption is correct.
Okay, but see, I'm not granting that. I'm only granting that you've described a scenario in which it's more likely, like that tails is more likely than heads, because you've specifically set up a scenario in which that is true pretty much as a matter of stipulation. And then I'm wondering, okay, so
well,
now
I don't think it's as a matter of stipulation. The scenario
is a matter of stipulation. So maybe we disagree about
stipulate that.
Like, a scenario doesn't stipulate it.
The scenario doesn't stipulate that tails is likelier than heads. That's a substantive claim.
Is it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it is.
Well, it is. One way you know it's not stipulated by the scenario is that most people deny the conclusion.
Well, it may be that they are conceptually confused, or that I would disagree with their assessment of the scenario.
Well, I agree that I would also disagree with their assessment of the scenario, and that I think they're wrong about what your credence should be in the scenario. But I think that I think they're like substantively mistaken about what you should think about the scenario.
Right, but note what you said, that's what their credence should be. And so now this is making me wonder whether there are even more fundamental differences between how we're evaluating these scenarios. I don't think there's some sort of like stance independent normative fact about what one's credence should be. So it may be that I think that there's no fact of the matter here, like literally at all.
Yeah. Well,
if that's a lurking presumption that needs to be unpacked, I don't think there's a normative question here. Do you?
I don't know. I mean, like, do you think that there's a fact of the matter about like Newcomb's problem, for example?
No, I don't.
Do you know about the Sleeping Beauty problem?
I don't know that much. I've encountered it a little bit, but I do consider that Newcomb's problem to be a pseudo problem. And it's another case where I think that it's structured in a way where the answers are trivial, which is whether I think if it's adequately specified and it just disambiguates in a way that reliably favors like one boxing in particular, or it's underspecified in a way that two boxing seems reasonable. Certain inadequate specifications. And I know that that's probably not a popular view on the matter, and it's not an area where I'm particularly confident because I don't study this stuff. But what I've heard about the dialectic between people is that generally it's just that there's these competing decision theories, and there's just like philosophers are kind of stuck on a silly decision theory that makes you less money. And they're just like, but that's the rational thing to do, which strikes me as like pretty stupid. So I don't know why one boxing isn't ascendant on that matter. But the reason I think one boxing ends up being like the quote unquote correct answer is for completely trivial reasons. So I think very much the same of a lot of metaphysical speculation, that I think a lot of it is just kind of people goofing around with language and metaphysical presumptions in a way that I'm not sure actually maps on to judgments about what the world is really like in any sort of a reliable way.
Okay, do you think that there's some sense in which you can say, like, if you flip a coin and you haven't seen what it is yet, you should think there's a 50% chance that it came up heads. Maybe, not in a stance independent sense or something, but maybe, maybe in the sense of like, that's what your betting odds should be or something. Like, do you think there's some way of interpreting that sentence that makes it true?
Yeah, and I could just tell you, like, I view probability as an, like, I don't think that there's like any essential probability out in the universe. Like, there's like it's a property of a thing. There's a 50% chance it'll do A instead of B. Rather, I see probability largely as an epistemic issue. Like, the more I know, the more I would asymptotically approach certainty about what would or wouldn't happen. It could be that it's indeterminate in certain cases, or I'd run up against some sort of epistemic wall for whatever reason. But I would view it as in a Bayesian terms, and there are plausible. Like, I can imagine a scenario where someone, just imagine a real world scenario. Person over there flips a coin. I'm confident it's fair for what I could imagine bracketing because I actually think that there's some evidence that one side is more likely to land, like the side you flip it on is more likely. So there's all these empirical considerations. If I could somehow bracket those and set those aside, I might bet at on the odds on the assumption that there's about a 50% chance. So I could do that.
Yeah. Right.
So I guess that's a long way of saying, yeah, I think basically I can do that.
Yeah. So then I think whatever you're doing there is like what I think you can apply here for what you're creating.
Right. But am I assigning some type of probability to different models for what explains the universe? Is that what I'm doing? So, like, models are the stand-in for like a dice, like it's an X amount of sided
like you said, the odds of God existing. Like you, and by the way, I should get going kind of soon. But you said the odds of God existing is what? But yeah, I'd be happy to chat again later. Yeah, you said the odds of God existing is like 1 in a million. That's your assessment. So I think whatever you use to say that, it's like, okay, you could apply that to this case.
I'm not sure I can. Like, I could apply it to the cases you've described, but I'm not sure how to translate that over into the world as it is.
Well, you sort of look at the features of the world and see which ones are more expected on certain hypotheses than on other hypotheses. Maybe it'll be a bit vague or indeterminate, but yeah. I mean, I think your existence is likelier on the hypothesis that there are more people, as is evidenced by the cases where the self-indication assumption is right. But yeah, I mean, I think
I'm not convinced of.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess you agree that your credence and tail should be 1,000,000 times higher than your credence and heads in that case, but you just think you don't know.
It sure does seem like that to me. Yeah. I guess you got to go soon, but what are the other views about the matter? Because it being 50-50 sounds like a very silly conclusion to me. Why would someone draw that conclusion?
So there's a view called the self-sampling assumption. And what the self-sampling assumption people say is you shouldn't reason. You should reason as if you're randomly selected from, you should think of yourself as sort of randomly drawn from the set of actual people. So you say, if I'm just a random draw from the set of actual people, well, no matter how many people there are, I'm a random guy. So, yeah, so I don't have a reason to think there are more people.
Okay.
And that's defended by Nick Bostrom in this book.
Okay. I mean, this is just something I would have to look into more. Maybe I would revisit those views and take them more seriously. But it is interesting in this case, at least my initial reaction is to share your perspective on the matter. Maybe you're framing it in a biased way and I'm not noticing.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't think so. I mean, like, yeah. Like, I think a case like the main counterexample that people give to the self-indication assumption is they just say, look, the self-indication assumption implies that you should think that the universe has infinite people because, it implies that more people existing is more likely. And this is just one variant of that. But yeah, anyways, yeah, I should get going, but it was good having you on, Lance. Happy to chat again sometime. And yeah, happy to send you some stuff about the self-indication assumption.
Do so. And then we could talk about fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony another time.
All right. Sounds good. Have a good day. And thanks everyone for watching.
Right, see ya.